Welcome to Root, a game of woodland might and right. Root is an asymmetric strategy game in which every faction plays uniquely. That means they have different rules, different components, different things they can do on their turn, and the paths to victory are many and varied. So, let's dive right in. There are 4 different factions in Root: the Marquis Cat, the Eerie Dynasty, the Woodland Alliance, and the Vagabond. Each seeks to control and dominate the woodland, which takes the center stage of Root. The Marquis Cat seeks to expand, subjugate, and industrialize the forest, bringing all other critters to heel. The Eerie Dynasty seeks to reclaim their lost glory, taking back their treetop thrones and conquering the forest. The Woodland Alliance is a peaceful band of creatures who have been forced to take up arms to fight against their oppressors. And the Vagabond is a fiendish rogue who helps some and hinders others, all according to his inscrutable goals. But regardless of which faction you play, the core goals remain the same. You control regions, you craft cards, and you battle for supremacy. A bit like Risk, but highly strategic and with cute woodland creatures. So how does a game of Root actually play? Well, setup is about the same each time, but it is specific to each faction. So depending on which factions are in play, the board can change a little bit. But assuming you have all 4 factions in play, this is kind of what it looks like. You have the Marquis Cat, who is spread out over the entire forest, but their forces are spread thin. The Eerie Dynasty is tucked away into a corner, but has a horde of warriors ready to spring forth and conquer. The Woodland Alliance is not even present on the game board at start. They're waiting to spread sympathy and launch a revolt at an opportune time. And the Vagabond sits in the forest, wondering who to support in this politically unstable environment. Now, even though each faction plays differently, they have several things in common. First, they each have a player board, and this roughly outlines how the faction plays and what they can do. Now, while the actions that each player can take are unique to their faction, the overall flow of their turn is similar. They go through 3 phases on a given turn: birdsong, daylight, and evening, and these roughly correspond to preparation, actions, and maintenance. Before we get to how each faction actually plays, let's look at some other commonalities, starting with the game board. There are 2 major elements on the game board of Root: clearings and the paths which connect them. Clearings are the regions of Root. They are where warriors are placed, where buildings are built, and generally what each player is trying to control and conquer throughout the course of the game. Clearings have a few additional features. They have building slots, which limit the number of buildings which can be built, and they have a suit, which corresponds to the cards each player has. Of course, due to the asymmetrical nature of the game, every faction uses clearings in significantly different ways. The Marquis Cat relies heavily on these building slots because they have 3 different types of buildings, so they are trying to build as much as possible. The Eerie Dynasty only builds roosts, so they're more focused on building roosts and protecting those roosts. The Woodland Alliance hardly uses building slots at all, and instead relies on clearings to spread sympathy tokens, which can be placed anywhere. And the Vagabond really doesn't rely on clearings at all. He's there more to cause mayhem and sabotage other players. There are also 3 primary actions that are common to each faction in Root. These are moving, battling, and crafting cards. Starting with movement, a player is allowed to move to or from a clearing they rule, and a clearing they rule is one in which they have the most pieces. So in this case, the Eerie Dynasty rules this clearing, and the Marquis Cat rules these 2 clearings. Now the rules for movement are you can move to or from a clearing you rule. So the Marquis Cat could retreat here, or bring reinforcements in. Which brings us to the next action, battling. Supposing it is the Marquis Cat's turn, and they have 3 warriors here, the Eerie Dynasty has 3 here, they want to take control of this clearing, they may choose to battle. When they battle, the attacker rolls both dice. They get the higher value, and the defender is assigned the lower value. So in this case, the Marquis Cat scores 1 hit and wounds 1 warrior from the Eerie Dynasty. And that brings us to the third major action, which are cards and crafting, or crafting cards. Cards have unique effects, and they can be used for several things in a game of Root, but common to most cards are a suit in the upper left, a crafting cost in the upper right and lower left, and a description of what the card does if you choose to craft it. Cards have 4 suits. 3 of these, mouse, bunny, and fox, correspond to the clearings on the game board, mouse, bunny, and fox. When a card is used for its suit, it is usually used to activate a special faction ability. So the Woodland Alliance, for example, relies on card suits to spread sympathy and eventually incite revolt in clearings matching that suit. You'll notice there is a 4th suit, which is the bird talons, or birds, and these are wild. They count as clearings of any variety. So we'll get into how cards can be used for each faction specifically, but in general, cards can also be used for the text that the card has. And there are a few different types of these. There are immediate special actions, such as this ambush card. So if we have a case here where the Eerie Dynasty decides to attack the Marquis Cat, and they have this ambush card, they can choose to play this card, because this is a fox clearing, and remove 2 Eerie Dynasty warriors before battle even starts, significantly evening the odds. But most cards are not that highly specialized. There are also persistent actions, which are gray stone boxes. And these, once you craft them, you can have them next to your game board and activate them whenever you choose, whenever the text says you may. And then there are also crafting cards. And these score a victory point and allow you to create an item which the Vagabond can then trade you cards for. Most cards have a crafting cost in the bottom left corner. And what each faction needs to craft a card varies, but in general it is a building of some sort, or a token. So to craft a card, you must have that type of token in the card's type of clearing. So here on this mouse card, you can see that the crafting cost is a single bunny. That means for the Marquis Cat, they have a workshop, which is the building that allows them to craft cards, and they have it in a bunny clearing, which means that on their turn, they could craft this card, take the boots, add it to their crafted items slot, and then score a victory point, which is the primary purpose of those cards. If you were to craft one of these persistent effect cards with the gray stone boxes, those stick next to your game board, and you can use them whenever you'd like, whenever the text allows you to. So now that we know a little bit about the fundamentals of Root, moving, battling, controlling regions, and crafting cards, how do you actually win a game? Well, as you might have guessed, it varies for each faction. The Marquis Cat is trying to build as many buildings as possible, and they earn victory points for each building that they remove from their board. The Eerie Dynasty is trying to construct as many roosts as possible, and they get points each turn for every roost they have on the board. The Woodland Alliance earns victory points for every sympathy token that they put on the board. And the Vagabond scores in the most unique way of all, in that they can score by aiding factions by giving them cards. They can earn points for attacking factions that they consider hostile. And they are also trying to complete unique quests, which give them more cards or more points. The first player to get to 30 points wins the game. If, in the course of the game, you acquire one of these dominance cards, you lose the ability to score in the traditional manner, and instead you must fulfill a specific goal. 3 of these relate to controlling clearings of a matching suit at the beginning of your turn, so controlling 3 mouse, bunny, or fox clearings at the beginning of your turn. Or this bird dominance card, controlling clearings at the opposite ends of the game board. So Those don't come into play terribly often, but they do spice things up. Now let's move on to what makes this game really special, the unique factions. First, the Marquis Cat. She represents supply chain management at its finest. Her goal is to build as many sawmills as possible, to harvest as much wood as possible, to build more sawmills, to build workshops, to craft cards, and recruiters to hire warriors. The Marquis Cat is a sort of snowball, where they get more and more powerful. They get more buildings, which allows them to do more on their turns, allows them to get more warriors, so they can control more clearings and set up more buildings. It's very traditional, you get bigger and bigger and bigger faction. So let's take a look at their faction board, which dictates how they play and how their turns go. So first, Marquis Cat has access to two unique functions, and those are the Keep. The Keep is essentially their home space. It represents their faction capital, if you will. And they have access to this unique trait, Field Hospitals, which is whenever their warriors are removed, they can spend a card matching the clearing where their warriors were fighting, and those warriors can be recovered and healed and placed at their keep. Now, in the course of a turn, they place one wood at each sawmill they have, which at the start of the game will only be one. And then for their actions, they can first craft using any of their workshops. So those are their special building that allows them to craft cards. So in this case, Marquis Cat could craft this card because it has a cost of 1 bunny clearing, and they have a workshop in a bunny clearing. So they could craft this card. And then the fun stuff. They can take up to 3 of the following actions, plus 1 for each bird card they choose to spend. Battling, marching, recruiting, placing 1 warrior at every recruiter they have on the board, building in a clearing they own. They can place a building and pay that number of wood, earn that number of victory points, and overworking. They can spend a card to place 1 wood at each sawmill in a matching clearing. And then finally, in the evening, they draw cards. So the Marquis Cat is actually the simplest faction in Root. They play fairly predictably, and they don't have a lot of special rules. Next, we have the Eerie Dynasties, and they represent overpromising politicians. So they have a fearless leader who tells people that they are going to win and keep winning as long as he has their support. But, like all politicians, he has to keep making grander and grander promises about their accomplishments. And if he ever fails, then the whole clan falls into turmoil and terrible things happen. So it's an interesting balance. This faction has a couple of interesting traits. They rule any clearings where they are tied, which doesn't come into play terribly often, but it's nice for them. And disdain for trade. When crafting, they only score 1 victory point. So there are some cards that will score you multiple victory points. That doesn't come into play very often. The main focus of the faction is their decree. The decree dictates which moves you have to take during the course of your turn. And you have to take all of those actions, otherwise you fall into turmoil and bad things happen. So to start with, the Eerie Dynasty has a leader which gives them 2 basic actions. That's kind of their starting point. It dictates how they begin the game, but not how they progress. Beginning with Birdsong, if their hand is empty, they draw a card. Then they add 1 or 2 cards to the decree. And only one of these can be a wild bird card. And this is especially important for this faction. So, they add a card to the decree, which allows them to take that action or take an extra of that action. Let's say they add these 2 cards. So right now, their decree says they can recruit in a bunny clearing, they can move in any clearing, they can battle once in any clearing, and they have to build once in any clearing. So the Eerie Dynasty is led by a fearless leader who has been installed by his clan, and they think that he will bring them victory. The leader dictates the beginning of the decree, and the decree is the most important part of the Eerie Dynasty. It does not only dictate which actions they can take, but which actions they must take every round, otherwise they fall into turmoil, and as you can imagine, terrible things happen. So, they install a leader, which gives them a starting point for which actions they must take. In this case, the despot gives them move and build. The Eerie Dynasty's only building is roosts, which they recruit warriors from and which they are generally trying to protect. And they have a couple of interesting traits. So they're lords of the forest, which means that they rule any clearings in which they are tied, which helps them a little bit. And when they are crafting cards, they only score 1 victory point. Some cards can give you multiple victory points. This doesn't come into play all that often. Moving on to their turns. In their birdsong, if their hand is empty, they draw a card. Then they add 1 or 2 cards to the decree. And this is an especially important part of their turn because the player must plan out which actions they will be able to take. So here they can add 2 cards. They choose to add these 2. Only 1 can be a bird card, which if you remember, bird cards are wild. That means they can take those actions in any clearing, not just the matching suit. And then if they have no roosts, they place a roost and 3 warriors in the clearing with the fewest warriors. And if they have to do that, things are going very badly, so let's move on to brighter times. In their daylight phase, they can craft using roosts instead of workshops. And then they resolve the decree from left to right. And they have to take each action, and they take that action the number of times that there are cards in that slot. So here, they recruit in a bunny clearing. They move from matching clearing, but because this is a bird card, it is any clearing. They battle in any clearing, because again, it is wild. And then they build in a matching clearing. So this is where they spread out more roosts and have more recruitment options. And finally, they score a victory point for every roost slot that's empty. So here they score 1 victory point, and then they draw cards. If you cannot take all of the actions in the decree for any reason, that's when terrible things happen. The clan falls into turmoil, which means they are humiliated. They lose 1 victory point for every bird card that they have in their decree. There is a purge, so they discard all decree cards except for their loyal viziers, who will be shuffled off and reassigned. The leader is deposed and a new leader assigned. Hopefully he'll do a better job. And finally, the turn is ended immediately and you go to evening. So, not happy times. There's also the Woodland Alliance, who are your local cuddly revolutionaries. They spread sympathy tokens across the board, incite revolt at an opportune time, oust their oppressors, and establish bases of operation to train officers. The Woodland Alliance plays much differently than the Eerie Dynasty or the Marquis Cat, and they're also somewhat more complex. So they are masters of guerrilla warfare. They have less of the out-and-out, I'm here to conquer and control, and more of the, I'm going to wait behind the scenes and then strike at an opportune time. Moving on to the player board, the faction is aided by 2 traits. Outrage, when a player removes one of their sympathy tokens from a clearing, they have to play a card of that matching suit and give it to the player. If they can't, the Woodland Alliance draws a card, so it adds to their options. And guerrilla warfare, which is the most important one, when they are battling in a clearing, they actually take the higher die result instead of the lower, even as the defender. The Woodland Alliance is highly reliant on a stack of cards called their supporters. Now, these supporters essentially dictate where they can spread sympathy and where they can revolt, so the player must keep a good track of them and use them to their best advantage because there are a limited number. Through the course of their turn, they can revolt any number of times in preparation. So they spend 2 supporters matching a sympathetic clearing. So supposing they had a sympathy here, they could spend this fox and bird card in order to revolt in this clearing, removing all tokens, placing a matching base, and warriors there equal to the number of sympathy tokens they have for that suit, and training an officer. They're also able to spread sympathy in the same way. So they can spend a number of supporters listed on the track down here to spread sympathy to a matching clearing. Now, because they spent a bird card, they can pick any clearing that is adjacent to an existing sympathy token. So they can spread sympathy here into this mouse clearing or here into this bunny clearing. Moving on to the daylight phase, this is more like an extension of their preparation, so it doesn't work quite the same way as it does for the other factions. Here they can craft, but they use sympathy tokens instead of any kind of a building. They can mobilize, they can add a card from their hand to their supporter stack. They can do these actions any number of times, so they could add their entire hand to their supporter stack if they really wanted to. And they can train. They can spend a card from their hand, matching a built base to place a warrior in the officer's box. So they could spend this bird card because that's where their only base is. Otherwise, they would spend a fox card, place a warrior in their officer's box. Now, why are officers important? Because, being a guerrilla warfare faction, they take all their military actions at night, in the evening. So in the evening, they take military operations up to the number of officers. They can move, recruit, place warriors at a base, battle, and organize to, instead of spending supporters, they spend warriors to spread sympathy in a clearing. And finally, they draw cards. So that's really the Woodland Alliance's whole goal. They don't have the military might that the other factions do, so they lay in wait, they strike at an opportune time, they establish concentrated bases of operation where they can spread more sympathy for their cause. Finally, we have arguably the most unique faction, the Vagabond. To borrow a phrase, the Vagabond is a sort of murder hobo. He roams around the map, finding items, helping some people, hindering others, and generally going about his own business, but messing everyone else up along the way. Instead of relying on a set number of actions, the Vagabond instead uses items as actions. So you may have been wondering what all these tokens are for up at the top of the map. The Vagabond actually collects them, and he can use them to take his specific actions on his turn. So, the Vagabond starts with a number of items dictated by what type of Vagabond he is. So, he has 3 options, the Thief, the Ranger, and the Tinker. Here, he is the Tinker. This gives him access to the unique ability to use a torch to take a card from the discard pile, matching the clearing he is currently in. And he also has 4 starting items: boots, a torch, a satchel, and a hammer. Now, regardless of which Vagabond you play, the rest of the board stays the same. The Vagabond is nimble, which means because he's only one person, he doesn't have to rule a clearing to move around. He can move anywhere he wants to. Second, because, again, he's only one pawn, he's not removed from the game every time he loses combat. Instead, a number of items are damaged. Instead of building structures, the Vagabond is working to build relationships, as well as to break them. So the Vagabond maintains relationships with each faction on the game board. They can use those in one of 2 ways. He can aid players by giving them cards, which scores him victory points. And once he gives them a certain number of cards, they're then allied, and he gets bonus points for every card he gives them. Additionally, the Vagabond can sabotage a player. He can attack them, ambush their forces, and remove their warriors, rendering them hostile. And once a faction is hostile, he gets a point for every piece removed from that faction. In the course of a turn, the Vagabond begins by refreshing items. So when items are used, they are flipped over and are unusable. So at the beginning of the turn, they are refreshed. And then he may slip into or out of a forest. If he's in a forest, he can take no actions, but it does allow him to repair items. Assuming that he has moved out of a forest, he can then go about using his items. Boots allow him to move, swords allow him to battle, torches allow him to explore runes. So here, in this case, the Vagabond can flip this torch over, use it to see what is underneath this rune, and put it into his satchel. So he's acquired another hammer. We'll come back to aiding and questing. You can use crossbows to remove a hostile piece in a clearing without engaging in combat and suffering loss. He can use hammers to repair his items. So when he engages in battle or someone attacks him, a number of items are damaged instead of pieces being removed from the board. And when an item is damaged, it is unusable. And hammers must be used to repair them. At any time, the Vagabond can also choose to aid a faction sharing his clearing. He does this by giving a card matching the clearing to that player. And he can also take items that they have crafted in exchange. So it's a bit of give and take. Next, and perhaps most interestingly for the Vagabond, he is trying to achieve specific quests. And these quests mean he must be in a particular clearing and have a certain combination of items. If he has that combination of items and he's in that type of clearing, he can turn the quest in and gain the reward, which either gives him cards or gives him victory points for every quest of that suit that he has turned in. And that is one of the main ways how the Vagabond gets more cards and scores points. Finally, in the evening, if he's in a forest, he repairs all items. He draws 1 card plus 1 card per coin stack, discards down to 5 cards, same as everybody else, and then he removes items. The Vagabond can only hold up to 6 items in his satchel, plus 2 for each bag he has. So even though he uses items for actions, he only has a limited number he can keep. So the Vagabond scales in a little bit of a different way from the other factions, where he's trying to collect items of specific types to fulfill quests, but he's also looking for utility items that he can't really use for anything that will let him hold more items, repair more items, refresh more items, etc. Root plays in 60 to 90 minutes once players are familiar with the rules, and is for 2 to 4 players. The publisher recommends it for ages 10 and up. However, I have found this to be rarely the case, unless a 10-year-old has spent the majority of their formative years playing incredibly complex games. Root is a highly strategic game and is almost certainly not suitable for anyone below the ages of 14. I'd say 14 and up for someone who is roughly familiar with games and interested in strategy games is a good starting point for Root. Of course, despite its complexity, Root feels very approachable just because the components and illustrations are so darn adorable. The mice and bird and cat meeples are all lovely. The illustrations add a layer of comedy and warm fuzzies to an otherwise very complex and very political and violent struggle. So despite the very approachable appearance, Root is a highly strategic, highly in-depth game. If you enjoy games like Risk and Settlers of Catan, you can imagine Root as being the most complicated versions of those smashed together, with some other elements added in. Of course, this is what allows Root to really shine. You have 4 different factions, they all play incredibly differently. You can find the one you like. You play to your faction's strengths. It makes it very interesting if you have fewer than 4 players, even though 4 is the best. You can mix and match and create different dynamics on the board. They're all very interesting. So overall, Root is a great choice if you're looking for a heavyweight strategy game with adorable woodland critters.